Hello everyone, and welcome back to Deep Chronicles World. I usually don't say anything at the start of these compilations, but hit me up for the next 15 seconds. Most of you aren't getting my notifications anymore. Can you please check if you're still subbed? YouTube has been turning it off for a bunch of people, so you might want to check that alright, and before you cozy up and drift off into dreamland. Why not drop a comment below and share where in the world you're tuning in from? And hey, if you're enjoying these stories as much as I love sharing them, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. Now, let's get comfy, relax, and dive into tonight's tale. Ready? It's beginning October 18th, 1992. A 23-year-old girl disappeared from inside her house, leaving behind a trail of unnatural questions and mysteries. Surveillance cameras revealed that she entered her house at 12 p.m. and never left. Nothing strange happened inside or outside the house, okay? But the shocking and bizarre thing was that the same girl, without ever leaving the house, was captured by the cameras returning to the house at 2 p.m. This means that within 2 hours, okay, she entered the house twice without ever leaving. Alongside this, there were a staggering number of crimes and mysteries that defy logic. Let's assume that each mystery has a password. Farah. The passwords in this story are split personality, cute Aztec legend, the appearance and revelation of Jesus Christ. Peace be upon him. Today, I will tell you about a series of strange crimes committed by one person. All the crimes he committed were aimed at fulfilling an ancient legend that would help him transform from one body to another. When his plan was exposed and failed, he remained silent. He didn't utter a single word until he and all the prisoners with him saw Jesus Christ before them. He then announced his repentance and confessed to everything. By the way, this story didn't happen 2,000 years ago. It happened just a few years ago. The things I've told you about, which you find strange and illogical, are all true and all happened. When you listen to this story and follow it in order, you will understand everything and be shocked by the amount of truth in it. Before we begin, I want everyone to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. The most important thing you can do for me is to turn on notifications. We don't want to stop the support and continue on our way. And now, before we start, as we always say, all stories have similarities, but not like when I tell you. On July 26, 1974, specifically in the city of Provincetown, Massachusetts, a 16-year-old girl left the hotel she was staying in at 6 a.m. to go for a run in the green plains surrounding the city. While running, a dog appeared in front of her, barking loudly and circling around her. The girl understood that she needed to follow the dog to find out the reason for its strange behavior. Indeed, she followed it and reached an empty, flat area where she saw something completely unexpected, a decomposed and decayed body, which was very scary and disgusting. The girl immediately contacted the police and informed them of the body's location. As soon as the police arrived, the investigations began, and the information was very strange and illogical. The first thing you need to know is that Provincetown is a tourist town with a population at that time not exceeding 15,500. The town is designed for relaxation and is the last place you'd expect crimes to occur. The last crime that happened there was before World War II, meaning before 1945. So, the presence of a body in this town, in the condition it was found, was very strange. Of course, the strangeness didn't stop there. The body was of a large girl. She was of considerable size with red hair. Under the body was a large towel, like the ones used on beaches. This might not make sense, but it seemed like the girl was lying there, sleeping before the killer came and killed her. Despite the body being decomposed and the crime having occurred more than 2 weeks prior, the body was intact with no signs of violence. This means that the killer either drugged her, or she was already asleep when he killed her, or there was some familiarity. between her and the killer, which is why she didn't resist and never expected him to kill her. The second thing the investigators noticed was the manner of death and the condition of the body. As for the cause of death, it wasn't clear. The investigators couldn't determine it. There were 4 possibilities. The first possibility was a stab wound, because there were some wounds on her neck. The second possibility was slitting her throat, because the girl was slaughtered, and her head was almost separated from her body. The third possibility was internal bleeding in the head, because there was a large wound and bruise on the back of her head, as if the killer had hit her with a large object from behind. The fourth and final possibility was bleeding to death from her hand, because her right hand was cut from the wrist and the left's hand was cut from the palm. You will soon understand why I'm focusing on all these details. But the most important thing you need to know is that advanced examination revealed the victim bled to death because the amount of clotted blood in her body was very small. If the killer drained the body of blood like a slaughtered sheep that bleeds until all the blood is out. But the question that arises in this case is, where is the victim's blood? Because there was no trace of it. No one could find out, even though the entire town was combed, but there were no traces of any crime anywhere. In the end, in 1974, as we said, the investigators reached the following conclusions. The body was unidentified, and they named her the Lady of the Dunes because her body was found in a flat, hilly area. The manner of death was unclear due to the severe decomposition of the body. And even the place where the crime occurred was unknown because it was clear that the killer had moved the body to that location, Atia, and he killed her somewhere else, placing her there very calmly, as if his goal was for the police to reach the mysterious conclusions they did. Usually, when investigators reach a dead end, like they did in this crime, all suspicions point to the perpetrator being a serial killer because he is smart, knows what he's doing, and manages the crime scene with calm, genius, and intelligence. Moreover, he is capable of hiding evidence, so they are dealing with someone who is not ordinary at all, not someone who is killing for the first time in his life. The last piece of information I want to tell you about this crime is that the victim was only in swimwear, meaning her clothes were not found. Okay, and believe me, this whole story is one thing, and the story of the blood in women's clothing is another. Before we move on to the next crime, you need to know that for 50 years, no one could find out who this girl was or how the crime happened. 12 years after this crime, another crime occurred, which is considered stranger than the first. On May 31, 1986, a 6-year-old girl named Michelle was swimming in the pool at their home in Maryland, USA. The girl was always in front of her father, calm, and everything was very normal until the father went inside for half an hour. When he came out, he didn't see his daughter. He searched and looked, but there was no trace of the girl. He called the police and informed them of her disappearance. Okay, the search operations began, but the police couldn't find any results. This event caused Carl, the father, to lose his mind. He had a nervous and mental breakdown. After 3 months of medical care, the father recovered. As soon as he regained his health, he confessed that he was the one who kidnapped his daughter. He kidnapped his daughter while she was with him in the same house. He told them that in the week of the girl's disappearance, the father and mother separated, and due to the pressure he was under, he decided to kill his daughter. He took her to an empty area and killed her there, then threw her in the river. But where is this empty area, and where is this river you're talking about? Because the entire city didn't have a river. He told them he didn't know, but that's what happened to him. Anyway, a month after this confession, the father retracted his statement and said that everything he told them was not true. This caused a big problem for the investigators because for a whole month, the search had stopped. The investigation was stable, and all their focus was on the father being the one who killed his daughter, but after the father retracted his confession. The case went into 600 walls because, logically, after a whole month of stopping the investigations, the kidnapper could hide the body and 100 more bodies, and he could hide all the evidence. Therefore, reaching the real perpetrator became impossible, and unfortunately, the girl disappeared. And this case was also recorded as unsolved. The mystery remained, and everyone was convinced that the father was the one who killed his daughter, even though his confession was illogical and not true. He was telling them he threw her in a river, and the city they lived in didn't have a river. But there was no other suspect in this case besides the father. There was another person who was investigated but was released due to lack of evidence against him. This person who was investigated was named Hayden Clark, a simple gardener who was staying at his brother's house temporarily and had no criminal record. But they arrested him and investigated him because he knew the girl, Michelle. It seemed like he was in their neighborhood, greeting her and joking with her, and he was very loved and kind to her. When the girl disappeared, even though this man, Hayden, was kind and his personality was as it was, they saw that he wasn't affected by her absence, so they thought he might be the type of person who kidnaps children. So they investigated him, but after the investigation, there was no evidence to convict him, so they released him, and his story ended there. Anyway, my dear friend, we leave this story and go to the first disappearance case I told you about at the beginning of the video, which happened on October 18th, 1992, when a 23-year-old girl disappeared from her house. The cameras captured her entering the house twice, even though she never left the house. The girl's name was Laura Holt Ling, a Harvard graduate living with her mother. As I told you, the girl disappeared from inside her house. When the investigators checked the cameras, they didn't see anything strange, except that the girl entered her house twice within 2 hours. The investigators examined the house several times and didn't reach any conclusion or evidence, except that by chance, the investigators noticed a small blood stain on Laura's pillow. This happened a month after Laura's disappearance. Anyway, as soon as they spotted the blood stain on the pillow, they took the pillow for forensic examination. The examination revealed that it was Laura's blood, and not only that, but a miracle happened that no one expected, which solved all the mysteries and revealed the identity of the killer. There's nothing else to say except that it was as if God Almighty decreed that this man be exposed, because he was exposed in a very strange way. You need to know that fingerprints can be found anywhere, but it's difficult or almost impossible for fingerprints to leave a mark on rough or woolen fabric. Laura's pillow fabric was very rough and woven, and there were no fingerprints on it. When the house was examined, the investigators didn't find any strange fingerprints, so they thought the girl had run away from her house and no one had kidnapped her. They said she wasn't kidnapped or killed, but she ran away from the house in a certain way. But how did this happen? And how did she leave the house in the first place? What happened, my friend, is that Laura's pillow had a small plastic sticker sewn into it with leather edges. The tag that usually has the manufacturer's name and pillow. Specifications on this sticker had a part of a strange fingerprint. The investigators discovered the presence of the fingerprint in the lab by chance after they saw the small bloodstain and took the pillow to the lab. While examining the blood, they exposed the pillow to ultraviolet light, and by chance, they found a fingerprint on this small part of the pillow. They took this fingerprint and, by checking criminal records, identified the killer. The surprise was that the killer was Hayden Clark, the simple gardener I told you about in the previous crime. Over the years, they discovered that this simple worker had a story and suffering that no human mind could imagine, and the reason all goes back to his family. As soon as Hayden Clark was arrested, he didn't confess to anything. All the investigations conducted with him were met with silence. He didn't utter a single word. he remained in this state for 8 months. The problem was that the investigators knew he was the one who kidnapped and killed Laura. But they didn't know how and had no information about the crime except Clark's fingerprint. Not only that, but during 8 months, 14 officers interrogated him, and all of them said the same thing. Throughout the entire investigation period, they never heard his voice. In the first period, he was detained in a solitary cell, but he didn't do anything or say a word. Okay? They even deprived him of food, thinking he would at least ask for food. Okay? But he never reacted or moved from his place or asked them for anything. They put another prisoner with him for 2 weeks, but he didn't talk to him or communicate with him at all. Because of this, they decided to transfer him to a group cell to interact with the people there, but he still didn't interact with anyone. He was presented to a medical examination committee, and he still didn't interact with them. All the indicators were negative. Logically, how can you diagnose someone who doesn't talk or interact with you? Things remained like this for 8 months until he finally spoke. Okay, and the reason was a white teddy bear that entered his interrogation room and made him break down in the literal sense. As we said, Clark never interacted with the investigators, but the investigations didn't stop and continued elsewhere. Since Clark was the one who killed Laura, it was certain that he was also responsible for the disappearance of the girl Michelle. Before we continue, you need to know something. Clark's fingerprint was on Laura's pillow, but it wasn't confirmed that he was the killer. The reason is that Clark worked as a cleaner in the gardens of the neighborhood where Laura lived, meaning he was a regular in the neighborhood and had a daily shift from morning to evening. So, the presence of the fingerprint, even though it was in a private place on the pillow in the bedroom, doesn't necessarily mean he was the killer. There are many logical reasons for the fingerprint being in that place without Clark being the criminal, such as the possibility of a special relationship between him and Laura. The reason for his silence and lack of interaction with the investigators could be due to his sadness over her disappearance, meaning if he loved her and had a relationship with her, he might have been sad about her. In general, any investigation operates on the principle that the suspect is innocent until proven guilty. That's why they were dealing with Clark gently, because it wasn't necessarily him being the criminal, especially since all the information that about him was that he was a kind and simple man, and his record showed that he was far from crime. However, the case of the 6-year-old girl Michelle cut through the doubt. What happened was that the investigators opened Michelle's case file, and a team of investigators went to search Clark's brother's house, because during the time Michelle disappeared, Clark was living in that house. The story of Michelle's disappearance had happened 7 years prior, so it was almost impossible to find any evidence against Clark, especially since he had lived in that house for less than 6 months. So it was unlikely that there would be any evidence against him in that house. Anyway, the distance between Clark's house and Michelle's family was only 20 meters. The investigators requested to search the room where Clark slept, and the shocking surprise was that the room was exactly as it was. Nothing had changed in 7 years. The room was abandoned, and after Clark left, no one had entered it. During the search, the investigators found 3 bloodstains on the floor near Clark's bed. DNA testing and forensic analysis revealed that it was Michelle's blood. Therefore, Clark was the one who killed her in his room, but the investigators had no evidence or information to know how the crime happened. During the investigation with his brother, it turned out that he had no knowledge of the matter, but he told them that Clark was not normal and had been diagnosed with acute schizophrenia years ago, and his condition had reached a point that was expected. He told them a very strange sentence. If you want him to confess to anything, bring him Michelle's white teddy bear and remind him of her, because there are many details that connect him to it. And this teddy bear never left her. Indeed, this is what happened. After 8 months, Clark started interacting with the investigators, but only through gestures. He made very strange movements, like doing yoga or sometimes sitting and praying, but everything changed when he saw the teddy bear. Imagine, the investigators had only one request. They told him, "Where are the bodies?" They were sure he knew where the bodies were because they found Michelle's blood in the room where he slept, meaning there was no room for doubt that he was the criminal, but they wanted to know where the bodies were. He didn't talk to anyone until he saw the teddy bear. He smiled a wide smile and stared at it for half an hour, then entered a state of severe tension and broke down crying, saying, "I killed Laura and I killed Michelle." Here, the investigators were happy and said, "Now he will confess everything." But unfortunately, he went silent again, and the investigation ended with that sentence. They tried with him for another 5 months, but he didn't confess to anything, and the investigation ended with an unsatisfactory result. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, but the story didn't end there. On the contrary, you could say that the story started here, but first, you need to know who Hayden Clark is and why he did what he did, and then I will tell you how he confessed to all the crimes he committed. Hayden Irving Clark was born on July 31st, 1952, in the city of Troy, New York. His grandfather was the mayor of the city, and the Clark family was very wealthy and famous. His father had a master's degree in management and a PhD in chemistry, and he held 3 patents for his revolutionary inventions that were found in most American homes, such as non-flammable carpets. In short, the Clark family was a model of the American dream, a wealthy, educated, and ideal family, okay? But behind this beauty and reputation was a very dark side. Hayden's mother and father were addicted to alcohol and illegal substances. The father claimed that he got his inspiration and creative ideas while drunk, but of course, this is not true at all. When he and his wife were drunk, they would torture their 4 children with beatings, insults, and various forms of abuse. The worst part was that his mother wanted her last child to be a girl, not a boy. When Hayden, the last child, was born, she treated him very badly. She dressed him in girls' clothes, called him Christine, put nail polish on him, and told him, "You were born a boy due to a genetic error, but in reality, you are a girl." She forced everyone to treat him as a girl when he was 7 years old, and I can't understand this. Can you imagine? 7 years old, and they were treating him as a girl since he was a child. What kind of people are these? One of his brothers addressed him in a masculine form or considered him a boy. They would punish him with beatings and torture. The father didn't know about this. He would beat and torture his children, but at the same time, he wasn't aware or didn't understand what was happening to his son. Anyway, when he turned 7, the father decided to enroll Hayden in school. On the first day, the school found out the whole story from Hayden through family protection and child welfare organizations. They forced the mother to stop these behaviors, so they wouldn't take her son away from her. This made the mother explode and treat Hayden even worse, with beatings and torture. When she beat him, she would force him to say, "I am a girl," and threaten to kill him if he didn't. She would tell him, "The school finds out what I'm doing to you, I will kill you so I don't get in trouble." After a few years of this behavior, the mother was transferred to a mental hospital because she had completely lost her mind. Unfortunately, by that time, Hayden, the child, was completely destroyed. Hayden Clark wasn't part of the LGBTQ+ community and didn't have any homosexual tendencies, but he was convinced that he had a feminine soul living in a male body. This belief caused him to develop acute schizophrenia. He was living with 2 personalities, male and female. His father, due to the school's threat to take Hayden away, withdrew him from school and made him continue his education at home, hiding him from society. That's why no one knew the truth about Hayden Clark. Only his family knew. When he turned 17, they enrolled him in a cooking institute, okay? which is considered one of the most important and famous institutes in the world. Through money and illegal means, Clark graduated and became a famous chef. But he wasn't accepted for any job because he wasn't normal and couldn't even boil an egg. After his father died, he worked as a gardener because he loved this job since he was a child. Anyway, in 1970, Clark was 22 years old when he accidentally heard about a legend that said the Aztec people lived in Mexico before Christ could change their gender through a magical method. If you were a male and wanted to become a female, all you had to do was slaughter a female, completely drain her blood, drink it, or the victim's clothes, and sleep in them. The next day, you'd wake up as a female. I don't know what to say to you, honestly. Can't understand how I'm continuing to narrate after this. How do such things spread, and how are such legends even told? How can people with brains believe this? Anyway, the strange thing is that Clark researched the idea and found it to be true. He claimed to have seen an ancient manuscript talking about this idea. Of course, this is a lie and not true. There are no manuscripts or anything, but he said this to support his claim. By the way, most of Clark's confessions were written. Times he would write. Other times he would draw pictures and expressions resembling the magical manuscript he claimed to have seen. Therefore, he had no choice but to kill a girl, drink her blood, and wear her clothes to transform into a female. Before we continue, you need to know that Clark, inside his house, only wore women's clothes. He had wigs, the ones people wear, on their hair, in all colors and styles. He was living his life as a female, but he didn't have any homosexual tendencies. He would say, I look like a man, and my actions are those of a man, but I have to be a female. I am a female inside. This is very strange, because usually when someone has this kind of disorder, it's accompanied by abnormal behaviors, but Clark was very normal. And the investigations proved that he had relationships with women. Now, you're waiting for me to tell you about each crime and when he confessed to them. I will tell you now. The first crime was in 2003. Clark confessed that in 1974, killed a very beautiful 20-year-old girl and placed her body in a tourist town. He told them that once, while working in the garden of one of the tourist resorts, a very beautiful girl passed by the garden. She was tall, with red hair. He followed her, and he had a knife with him. He kept walking behind her until she reached an area full of plains. The girl was going to exercise and was going to run in this place. Anyway, after making sure the place was empty, he hit her with the knife with all his force on the back of her head. He hit her at the moment she bent down to adjust her running shoes, which is why when she fell to the ground unconscious, there were no signs of bruises because the distance was very close. After that, he dragged her and hid her behind a large tree. There, he tied a rope tightly round her knees. His goal wasn't to strangle her. He wanted to stop the slight bleeding from her head. He went like a rocket and brought a bucket from the place he worked in. He slaughtered her and drained her blood into this bucket. After that, he took her clothes, left her body there until the next day behind the tree because he was sure no one would see her there. He took his things and went home, drank the blood, wore the clothes, and slept. Unfortunately, the experiment didn't work, and he remained a male. But God doesn't give him health. I don't understand what's going on in his head. A size 20 shoe is very big. Anyway, the next day, he went there, took a towel with cleaning materials, went to the body, and moved it to the place where it was found the next day. While going there, he was sure everything was normal, and no one noticed anything. Indeed, that's what happened. The body was in its place as he left it, so he carried it and moved it to a flat area, placed the towel on the ground, and laid her on the towel. After that, he wiped the body with cleaning materials and disinfectants to remove fingerprints and continued his life as if nothing had happened. As for why he cut off the right hand and the left hand, he loved fishing, cut off the hands, and used the fingers as bait for fish. Even though his confession was very clear and explicit, the police didn't connect his confessions with the victim until 20 years later. He killed her in 1974 and confessed to the crime in 2003, but the police didn't know what he was talking about until 2022, almost 50 years later, when they found out that Clark was the one who killed the Lady of the Dunes. By the way, her name was Ruth Marie Terry, and her husband reported her missing in 1974. So, Clark solved 3 cases. The case of Ruth, who disappeared. In 1974, the case of the Lady of the Dunes, who turned out to be Ruth, and most importantly, Ruth's husband was exonerated because he was accused of killing and kidnapping her. Now, we come to the second crime, the girl Michelle, whom he kidnapped and killed in 1986. In short, Clark knew that to transform, he needed to drink blood again, but this time, a child's blood. So, he planned to kidnap and kill Michelle. Kept changing his mind about her because he loved the girl, but due to his split personality disorder, he was able to kidnap and kill her. The story happened after the girl's father went inside. Remember, I told you she was swimming at home, and her father was with her, but he left her for a while and went inside. During this time, Clark greeted the girl from a distance and said, "Come, I bought you new toys." The details of this crime are very harsh and bloody, and I don't want to narrate them. I just tell you that he strangled her, slaughtered her, and did the same details as the first crime, okay? After killing her, he put her in a large bag and buried her in a remote area 12 miles from their house. He then returned to their neighborhood in the place they lived in, and it was as if nothing had happened. He drank the blood and slept, but he still didn't transform. Why? Because he has a shoe in his head. Anyway, the father confessed to killing his daughter. Remember, I told you the father confessed to killing his daughter and then retracted his confession. The reason was that he hated life and was devastated. He wanted to be sentenced to death. He had lost his wife, separated from her, then lost his daughter, and was bankrupt. He thought this was the best solution, but when he found out he would be sentenced to life imprisonment and wouldn't die, he retracted his statements. Now, the third crime. The 23-year-old girl. As soon as she arrived home, she went to the backyard, and he was working in the house next door. She insulted and humiliated him because he cut the trees in a way she didn't like. He knew the front of the house was monitored by cameras, so he went around to the backyard and entered through the basement door. He went up to her room while she was sleeping, lying on her bed. LP attacked her, put the pillow on her face, and kept stabbing her with a knife until she died. After that, he wrapped the body in the bedsheet and then in a large plastic bag. Before leaving the house, he saw the clothes she was wearing, including the hats she had put on her head. He put them in a bag and took them out through the basement door. He took her to the forest and buried her there, then returned to his house immediately. He wore her clothes, put on a wig of his own that matched her hair color, and returned to her house. He entered through the front door as if he were her. The story happened in 1992, meaning the surveillance cameras, folks, weren't that advanced. And he managed to mimic her walk, clothes, hair color, and size. There wasn't much difference between him and her, so it was very convincing. After entering the house, he cleaned everything and hid all the evidence. Then left the house through the basement door, and it was as if nothing had happened. Now, the final question I haven't answered yet. When did Clark confess? He confessed to these details in 2000. He took the police and investigators to the place where he buried the bodies. But he had a condition, and of course, the police agreed to his condition. His condition was simple and strange. He wanted them to bring him women's underwear, outerwear, jewelry, and a wig. When they brought him what he asked for, he wore them and took them to the place where he buried the bodies. Not only that, but he also took them to an old, abandoned building. This building belonged to his family. Beside this building, there was a metal bucket in more than 200 rings. When they asked him whose these were and where they came from, he remained silent and didn't utter a word. Here, so you don't get confused, you need to know that in 2000, he confessed to Michelle and Laura's cases. In 2003, he confessed to the Lady of the Dunes crime. As for me, I told you, each confession according to the order of the crime, not the order of the confessions. Anyway, the man remained silent until 2004. In this year, new prisoner arrived at the prison where Clark was held. This prisoner had done everything you can imagine: theft, fraud, false claims, drug trafficking, and everything else. But the most important charge was that he scammed people by claiming to be Jesus Christ. When he entered the prison, he had long hair and a beard, and he acted in front of the prisoners as if he were Jesus Christ. He wanted to deceive them just like he did it outside the prison. Among all the prisoners, who was the one who believed him? It's only one person: Hayden Clark. Clark went to him and said, "I want forgiveness. I want to confess everything to you." He confessed to 12 murders. I won't tell you about them so this video doesn't get deleted. The prisoner, who was pretending to be Jesus Christ, was so shocked by what he heard that he told Clark, "Teacher, if I were really Jesus Christ, I wouldn't be able to forgive you. No one can forgive you for what you've done. The things you've done, no one can forgive you for them. I'm the one who repented, not you." Imagine what Clark replied. Clark told him, "Don't be afraid. There's no need for you to deny that you're Jesus Christ. I can protect you as long as you're in this prison. Don't deny or hide that you're Jesus Christ. I'll protect you. I'm not telling you there's a shoe in his head. It's not normal. It keeps getting bigger." Anyway, this prisoner went to the prison administration and told them everything Clark had told him. He transferred him to another prison so he wouldn't harm Clark. They investigated Clark's cases, and to this day, the investigation is ongoing. Today, he is over 73 years old, and they are still investigating him, despite all the horrific crimes and atrocities he committed. The media is interested in him, and no one knows where the investigations with him have reached. But Hayden Clark is officially classified as the third most dangerous serial killer in the history of the United States. This was our story for today. I hope you liked it. If you're interested in strange stories like this video, I recommend you watch the video about the Black Assassin, who is considered the first and most dangerous assassin in the history of the United States. Tell me your opinion in the comments. Did Clark's problem start with his mother's behavior, or did he have an inherently aggressive and criminal behavior? And the last and most important question: how can a human being believe a legend like the Aztec legend unless there's a shoe in his head? Because they definitely don't have a brain. This was our story for today. I hope you liked it. Hey, if you're enjoying these stories as much as I love sharing them, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. Let's begin so many times in life. There are people we wish we had never met or spoken to. Tatsuya Ishikawa is one of those people. His criminal record is so extensive that he even altered his facial features to avoid being recognized. This is one of the most infamous crimes in Japanese history, the story of Tatsuya Ishikawa. Now, let's start the video. Our story begins with a girl named Lindsay Hawker, a third-year student from England. She had a normal and happy childhood with her parents and sisters in a city called Coventry. Lindsay was the top of her class, but not in a way that made her antisocial. She was loved by everyone and was very involved in school activities. She lived a very normal life until she graduated high school with a focus on biology. She then went on to study at university, where she majored in biology. Lindsay wanted to work directly in her field, but she felt the need to take a gap year to explore new places and discover new things. In 2006, she decided to go to Japan because it seemed like an advanced country with a culture very different from her own. She wanted to experience life in Japan, as she was also fascinated by Japanese culture. She said, let's do this. I'll spend this year in Japan. She started paying for many services, and since her first language was English, she began paying for language centers and schools to study Japanese. She was determined to make the most of her time there, just as she had always strived to be the best in school. She was very organized and always pushed herself to excel in everything she did. She applied to several schools, and in October 2006, she received an email from one of the most prestigious private language schools in Tokyo, informing her that she had been accepted. She had little time to prepare, so she quickly arranged her visa and organized her trip to Japan. She was accepted into one of the best schools in Tokyo at the time, Nova School. Naturally, she was thrilled when she received the email, but she was also stressed because she had to arrange everything quickly. In October 2006, Lindsay was on a plane to Japan. She was ready to start her new life, settle into her school, and begin her studies. Like anyone arriving in a new country with a new culture, she started exploring the city. Tokyo is not just any city, it's a massive, bustling metropolis with so much to see and discover. Lindsay would often wander around Tokyo after class, exploring what the city had to offer. This period was exciting for her, as it is for anyone who moves to a new culture. At first, everything seems amazing, but after a while, the initial excitement fades, and you start noticing the flaws in things that once seemed perfect. One of the first things she noticed was her living situation. She was staying in a nice place, but it was in a touristy area called Asakusa, which is well known in Japan. The problem with this area was that it was too touristy and the rent was high. Japan in general was expensive, especially at that time. The place was also very crowded, as I experienced myself when I visited this summer. It was packed. These are the photos and videos we started with in this video. This is the first story of Shibatori, and we'll go to the place where this story took place. If you liked this idea, leave it in the comments. Inshallah, I'll definitely return to Japan. It's an incredible country. Anyway, after some time, Lindsay started thinking about how to save money on rent. She decided to move to a different area, farther from the city center, and instead of living alone, she started living with 2 roommates in a place called Shiba. It was a long commute to school, but it wasn't a big deal. She saved a lot of money and lived with other people, which made life a bit easier. Living alone for the first time can be challenging, but she adjusted well. Life became more enjoyable, and she started going out with her roommates to explore new places and make plans. She felt like she was entering a new phase of her life, and she was really enjoying it. She even bought a bike and spent her days exploring the neighborhoods and alleys. She loved the atmosphere, and her studies were going well too. The Japanese were very professional, and everything was running smoothly. She just had to do her part and work hard. This continued until her 5th month in Japan. One day, Lindsay was leaving a metro station after class, ready to unlock her bike and head home. This was at Shiba Station, near where she lived. Normally, she would take the metro, get off at the station, unlock her bike, and ride home. In the morning, she would lock her bike near the metro and walk to school. No one really paid attention to the bikes, so it wasn't a big deal. But as Lindsay was unlocking her bike that day, she felt someone standing too close to her. She turned her head and saw a Japanese man staring at her. He introduced himself as Tatsuya Ishikawa and said, "You're my teacher." She was confused, because she didn't teach adults, only children. She told him, "No, I think you're mistaken." But he insisted, getting closer and trying to talk to her. She didn't want to engage with him, so she took her bike and left, not wanting to see him again. She was walking home. She heard someone running behind her. She could hear footsteps following her. She was almost home, but the person was still following her. At this point, we'll start calling him by his name, Tatsuya. Followed her for a long distance, running behind her. From this moment, I think most of you would have the same reaction as I did when I first heard this story. Every time I hear it, I want to scream. Lindsay? No. But you'll understand why as we go on. Before we tell you what happened, let's talk about who Tatsuya is. Tatsuya was a 21-year-old Japanese man living in Shiba. He came from a decent family. His father was a doctor, and his mother was a dentist. He was their only child, and they were financially comfortable. Tatsuya was expected to follow in his father's footsteps and become a doctor. However, after failing his medical school entrance exam, he was devastated. He didn't know what to do, so he switched to studying agriculture, which he didn't enjoy. In Japan, most people strive to excel in whatever they do, but Tatsuya wasn't interested in agriculture. He continued studying just to graduate, not wanting to waste a year. After graduating, he had no intention of working in that field, especially since his parents were financially supporting him. They gave him enough money to live comfortably without needing to work. They gave him around 10,000 yen a month, equivalent to about 1,000 Moroccan dirhams, without him having to do anything. He didn't shop, work, or even leave the country. Honestly, anyone in his position would feel like they were wasting their life. For Tatsuya, working was pointless because he was getting money without effort. He was lazy, and his parents always had to bail him out of trouble. He often caused problems, and his father had to pay to get him out of them. Once, he even assaulted a girl in an alley, and his father had to pay to settle the matter. Had no criminal record, because his father always paid to keep him out of trouble. He was essentially living off his parents' money while causing trouble. Despite this, Tatsuya had one thing he was passionate about: cycling. He would ride between 20 to 25 kilometers every day, in addition to going to the gym. He was in great physical shape, but he had no friends or social life. Spent his days alone, cycling and working out. Now, let's get back to Lindsay and our story. Lindsay was walking home when she heard someone running behind her. I told you that you'd want to scream no, because she didn't change her route or try to lose him. She continued walking home, and as she reached her bike, she could still hear him following her. She tried to lose him, but Tatsuya was persistent. It didn't stop until he caught up with her. At this point, most people would have a strong reaction. They would try to do something, but Lindsay started talking to him calmly. He told her that he had followed her because he wanted to help her with her Japanese studies. He offered to tutor her for 300 yen per hour, about 30 Moroccan dirhams. She refused, saying she wasn't interested, but Tatsuya didn't give up. After a while, he said, "Okay, no problem. But could you give me a glass of water? I'm tired from running after you." Again, you'd want to scream no, but Lindsay did something unexpected. She told him to come inside her apartment so she could get him a glass of water. You might be wondering why she would let him into her apartment. She thought that since she lived with two roommates, he would assume she was alone and might try to break in later. By letting him in, she wanted to show him that there were other people in the apartment. She also thought that if he stopped at the door, her roommates would see him and recognize him if anything happened. This was her reasoning for letting him in. She gave him a glass of water, and after drinking it, he thanked her and made one last attempt to convince her to let him tutor her. He said he was willing to teach her for 300 yen per hour in a public place like a cafe. She thought about it and agreed, thinking it was a good deal. She said, "Okay, let's do it." At that moment, you'd want to scream again, but Lindsay didn't think much of it. She gave him her number, and he gave her a piece of paper with his number on it. This piece of paper would later become very important in the story. They agreed to meet a few days later at a cafe. On March 24th, 2007, they met at a cafe not far from where they both lived. These are real photos from surveillance cameras showing Tatsuya and Lindsay together. Everything seemed normal at first. But at one point, Tatsuya started getting too close to Lindsay, making her uncomfortable. She moved away, but he continued to sit close to her. They had their first lesson at the cafe, and everything went smoothly. However, at the end of the lesson, Tatsuya told her there was a problem, said he had forgotten his money at home, and asked her to come with him to get it. She thought about it and agreed, but she insisted on taking a taxi to stay safe. She thought that if he had any bad intentions, he wouldn't do anything in front of the taxi driver. They took a taxi to his apartment building, and when they arrived, she told the driver to wait for her. She said she would be back in 5 to 10 minutes. This was Lindsay's last chance to save herself. She got out of the taxi and went up to Tatsuya's apartment with him. She never came back down. The taxi driver waited for a while, but eventually left. Lindsay never returned. Lindsay didn't come out of Tatsuya's apartment, and no one saw her again until that night. She was supposed to be at work, as she was studying at a language center, not a school, so her classes were in the evening. Her work noticed that she didn't show up, which was unusual for her. She had never missed work or been late in the 5 months she had been working there. They called her, but her phone was off. Hours passed, and by nightfall, her roommates started to worry. Lindsay had never done anything like this before. She had never stayed out late without letting anyone know. Her roommates couldn't sleep, so they reported her missing to the police. When the police were informed of her disappearance, her family was also notified. Her family was shocked because Lindsay had never gone this long without contacting them. It was Monday, the start of the week, and 2 days had passed with no sign of her. The police took the matter very seriously because it was highly unusual for someone to disappear like this. They went to her apartment and started searching for clues. They found the first lead in the case, the piece of paper Tatsuya had given her with his phone number and a drawing on it. The police started their investigation from there. They looked up his name and address and sent a patrol car to his apartment to see if he was there and if he had any connection to Lindsay's disappearance. When the police arrived at his building, they knocked on his door, but there was no answer. It was as if no one was home. The police then knocked on his neighbors' doors and asked if they could look into his apartment from their balcony. Neighbors agreed, and when the police looked into his apartment, they noticed something strange. There was a planter on the balcony that seemed out of place. It was filled with a lot of soil and had something sticking out of it. It looked like it had been recently disturbed. The police called for backup because they couldn't handle the situation alone. More officers arrived, and they decided to break down the door and enter the apartment. When they entered, they were shocked by what they found in the planter on the balcony. They found Lindsay's body. It was clear that Tatsuya had killed her and done something horrific. He had cut off all her hair and placed her body in the planter, covering it with soil and planting flowers on top. This was what the neighbors had seen from their balcony. Lindsay's family had already arrived in Japan by this point, and the case had become a national scandal. The entire country was talking about Tatsuya, who was still on the run. His face was plastered everywhere, and there was a reward for anyone who could provide information leading to his arrest. Japan is a unique country, and the way they handle missing persons cases is different. They even created a life-size mannequin of Tatsuya and placed it in stores so people could see how tall he was and what he looked like. This was the first time something like this had been done in a criminal case in Japan. The entire Japanese police force was searching for him, especially in Tokyo, but Tatsuya had disappeared without a trace. Tatsuya had vanished. Despite all the efforts to find him, Lindsay's family, including her parents and sisters, had come to Japan to be closer to the investigation and to help in any way they could. Even though the case was extremely difficult, they didn't give up. Her father even went to the Yakuza, the Japanese Mafia, to ask for their help in finding Tatsuya. He was desperate to find his daughter's killer. The entire country was turned upside down, and everyone was looking for Tatsuya. but he remained hidden for 2.5 years. You might be wondering how he managed to disappear and where he went. Tatsuya traveled all over Japan, from city to city, hiding in remote places. Sometimes he would stay in abandoned houses or in the wilderness, avoiding people at all costs. He needed money to survive, so he took odd jobs here and there, but nothing long term. During this time, he changed his appearance drastically. He cut his hair, shaved his eyebrows, and even altered parts of his face to avoid being recognized. His face had changed so much that it was almost unrecognizable. He managed to find work and save enough money to go to a plastic surgeon to further change his appearance. By this point, his face was completely different from what it had been when he killed Lindsay. He continued to hide like this until October 2009. In October 2009, Tatsuya's luck ran out. A plastic surgeon who had performed surgery on him recognized him from the news and reported him to the police. The police confirmed that it was Tatsuya and launched a new media campaign to show his new appearance. Lindsay's family and the entire country were motivated to find him. Japan, as a country, takes pride in its image, and this case was a stain on its reputation. After about 2 weeks, a construction worker in Osaka recognized Tatsuya and alerted the police. Tatsuya tried to flee before the police arrived, but they were able to catch him. He was no longer the ghost that no one could catch, and he was arrested. He didn't resist. He simply said, "I am Tatsuya Ishikawa." Finally, after years on the run, Tatsuya was caught. Initially, he was charged with trespassing, not murder. But while he was in custody, more charges were added, and he was held for 4 years before his trial began. His trial became a media sensation, both in Japan and internationally. Everyone was following the case closely. Lindsay's family wanted the maximum penalty, the death sentence. However, in Japan, if you commit only one serious crime, you're usually given a life sentence instead of the death penalty. So the most important thing was that he was caught. Now, let's find out what really happened to Lindsay when she went up to Tatsuya's apartment. Tatsuya claimed that Lindsay had gone up to his apartment willingly, and that he had killed her in a moment of panic, fearing that the neighbors would hear her screams. He said he had staged the scene to make it look like an accident, hoping to avoid the death penalty. He wasn't planning to kill her. He just wanted to reduce his sentence. On July 21st, 2011, almost 5 years after the crime, Tatsuya was sentenced to life in prison. Lindsay's family had hoped for a harsher sentence, as they wanted him to lose the most precious thing he had, his life. But this was the outcome, as it was his first major crime. During his time in prison, Tatsuya wrote a book recounting his experiences and how he had managed to evade capture for so long. The book sold over 100,000 copies, which is a huge number for a book in Japan. He said he would give the proceeds from the book to Lindsay's family as a gesture of apology, but they refused. They didn't want anything from him and wanted nothing to do with him. This is the story of Tatsuya and Lindsay. Sometimes, being too kind and trusting can lead you into situations you can't escape from. We hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it with as many people as possible who enjoy this type of content. Young man who was bullied in university decides to build bombs to take revenge on his bullies in a crazed manner. However, he gets caught and is sent to one of the most dangerous prisons in the world, where he begins to attempt an escape that seems virtually impossible. He also faces death multiple times. Will he succeed? What are the exact details of his story? Stay with me as the story begins in England with a child named Matthew, who was born and lives a very normal life in his early years. But as he enters adolescence, his mental state begins to deteriorate. He becomes increasingly irritable and impulsive to the point where he can explode in anger for no apparent reason. Over time, his mental state starts to show signs of danger. Due to his temper, and he grows up and enters university, specifically the University of Leeds. He begins to live a normal university life until one day, on his way to campus early in the morning, he is confronted by a group of people who stop him on the road. They rob him of everything he has and leave. Naturally, anyone would think of revenge, and of course, that's normal or even going to the police. But what wasn't normal was the way Matthew started thinking about revenge, which was through a bomb. This marked a complete turning point in Matthew's life because everything that followed would be filled with problems, difficulties, and a life of hardship. Matthew began buying and collecting local materials to build the bomb himself, deciding that he would make it rather than buy it, as there was no place selling bombs, right? He successfully completes his plan and manages to build the bomb. He then prepares for the second part of his plan, taking the bomb with him and riding his bike to the location where he knew the gang horde's group of people usually hung out. But when he arrived, he decided to go there early before they arrived and plant the bomb before they got there, intending to end their lives with it. Whoever got caught in the explosion, their lives would be over. It didn't matter to him. His mind was set on one clear goal: revenge. So Matthew went to execute his plan. He reached the bully's spot, planted the bomb, and left. Everything was going according to plan. But the one thing he didn't account for was a police officer who noticed Matthew's very strange and suspicious movements. The officer waited until Matthew left the area and then went to investigate what he had been doing there. To his shock, he found the bomb. Terrified, he quickly contacted the bomb disposal unit via radio, and they arrived swiftly, successfully disarming the bomb and taking it away. The police decided they needed to act quickly. They immediately went to Matthew's house without waiting for any higher authorization. They stormed the house, searched it thoroughly, and arrested Matthew from his room. But this was just the beginning. The handmade bomb they found was only the start of what they would discover in his house. As they continued their search, after arresting him, they were shocked to find a large quantity of weapons and materials for making explosives. All the evidence was against Matthew, proving his guilt beyond doubt. The police took him to the station, where they interrogated him for long periods, multiple times, until his trial date arrived. At just 19 years old, still a teenager in his first year of university, Matthew was shocked to hear that he was sentenced to life in prison. This sentence was devastating for him, and he began telling himself that his life couldn't end so tragically. If he served a life sentence, he would grow old, and his life would be over if he even made it out alive. The only thought that started consuming his mind was escape. He had to find a way to break out of prison. He couldn't spend his life there. The only escape route he could think of was through the prisoner transport van from the court to the prison. He had to act quickly and escape before he was officially imprisoned. The court issued its verdict, and Matthew was immediately transferred to the transport van. As soon as he got in, he began looking around the van, searching for any detail that could help him escape. He noticed that the officer next to him had the keys to the handcuffs and the van's rear door in his pocket. But he needed to find a way to get the officer to hand over the keys. He decided that his escape plan would rely heavily on psychological manipulation. He had to terrify the officer into obeying his commands. In seconds, Matthew pulled out a syringe he had hidden in his pocket and began stabbing his own hand, causing a large amount of blood to gush out in a horrifying manner. The officer was stunned and didn't understand what was happening. Matthew then claimed he had AIDS, a deadly disease transmitted through blood, and threatened to stab the officer with the syringe if he didn't unlock the handcuffs and open the door. The officer, terrified, complied. But for the second time, Matthew made a mistake. He didn't account for the other officers in the van. The officers in the front noticed what was happening and realized Matthew was trying to escape. Unfortunately for Matthew, they were just meters away from a police station. They immediately contacted the station and the officers there prepared to intercept the van. Matthew thought his plan had succeeded when the van pulled over, believing they were opening the door to let him escape. But as soon as the door opened, he was met with a group of armed police officers pointing their guns at him. They arrested him, beat him with batons, and put him back in the van. At that moment, he knew his escape attempt had failed, and his fate was sealed life in prison. The strange thing was that as the van continued its journey to the prison, Matthew noticed they had been driving for a long time without arriving. This meant they were heading to a very remote location. To his horror, he realized they were heading south in England, where there was only one notorious prison, Parkhurst Prison. Known as one of the worst prisons due to the dangerous criminals housed there, murderers, serial killers, and high-risk individuals. Naturally, with such a high-security prison, escape was nearly impossible. The prison was designed to be more secure than any other in England, making it difficult for anyone to escape or cause trouble. But Matthew was now one of those prisoners. He was taken to his cell, and as soon as he arrived, he began thinking about escaping from this terrifying prison. Could Matthew actually escape from this prison and save his life before dying inside? Before I answer that question, subscribe to the channel. When Matthew started leaving his cell and roaming during recreation times, he focused on every detail around him, trying to find any small thing that could help him escape. But the situation only seemed to get worse. Each time, he became more convinced that the prison was far more secure than he had imagined. The doors were reinforced, surveillance cameras were everywhere, and the guards at the reinforced doors were heavily armed and ready to kill anyone attempting to escape. Even if Matthew managed to bypass these three obstacles, he would face a fourth, a 6-meter high barbed wire fence. And if he managed to cut through the barbed wire, he would find another 6-meter high concrete wall behind it, nearly impossible to climb. But let's continue imagining if he somehow managed to make the impossible possible and climbed over both barriers. He would find himself on an island, surrounded by the sea on all sides. The island was like a small town with small houses and people who would immediately report him if they noticed him. Escaping via the water surrounding the prison would also be nearly impossible, as it would be easy for the prison to recapture him and impose even harsher penalties. Despite all these obstacles, Matthew remained determined to find any opportunity to escape. Over time, he began to notice a loophole in the prison. Construction and renovation work was ongoing, allowing trucks and vehicles to enter and exit the prison with building materials. This gave him an idea he could hide inside one of these trucks. He could escape. The next day, he approached a fellow prisoner named Keith, who was also serving a life sentence for murder. Matthew told Keith about the loophole he had found and how they could use it to escape. Keith, who was also desperate to escape, agreed to join him. Together, they began planning their escape. Keith revealed that he had also found a loophole. Most of the reinforced doors in the prison had only 2 types of locks, mostly red-colored. They could create a key that could open the red locks. They could unlock 95% of the prison doors. Keith convinced Matthew that making the key would be relatively easy in the prison workshop. But first, Matthew needed to learn blacksmithing. So, Matthew requested to join a blacksmithing training course offered by the prison. He was accepted and began working in the workshop. However, as soon as he entered, he noticed heavy security with many guards watching the prisoners. Matthew had to act naturally to avoid suspicion. As he worked, he noticed a door in the workshop with the red lock they needed to replicate. He began observing the lock closely, trying to understand its mechanism. Despite its complexity, he managed to gather enough information to attempt making the key. Over several weeks, Matthew secretly worked on creating the key in his cell at night, using small tools he had smuggled in. He was terrified of being caught, as the noise from the tools could alert the guards, but he persisted, working slowly and meticulously until he finally created a prototype key. The next day, During a break, he tested the key on a red lock in the workshop. It seemed to work, but then the key bent and got stuck in the lock. Panicking, Matthew managed to retrieve the key just before the guards returned. Realizing the key was too weak, he decided to make a stronger one using a harder metal. After another week of painstaking work, he successfully created a stronger key. This time, when he tested it, the lock opened. Overjoyed, Matthew shared the news with Keith, and they began planning their escape. However, their joy was short-lived. They overheard other prisoners talking about a failed escape attempt using the same method, hiding in a construction truck. After that failed attempt, security had been tightened with more cameras and guards. This news was devastating for Matthew and Keith, but they decided to proceed with their plan. They mapped out a route through the prison using the red locked doors leading to the outer walls. But the biggest challenge remained: the 6-meter-high barbed wire fence and the concrete wall behind it. To overcome these obstacles, they needed to cut through the barbed wire and build a 7-meter ladder to climb over the concrete wall. They decided to construct a ladder in the workshop, hiding the pieces and assembling them later. However, as they worked on the ladder, the guards began to suspect Matthew's suspicious behavior and banned him from the workshop. Undeterred, Matthew and Keith recruited a third prisoner, Andrew Rogers, who was also serving a life sentence for murder. Andrew, who was in charge of the workshop, helped them secretly build the ladder over 3 weeks. They hid the ladder pieces in the workshop, planning to use them during their escape. Their plan was to use the red locked doors to reach the outer walls, cut through the barbed wire, and climb over the concrete wall using the ladder. However, they received shocking news. The workshop was being relocated, meaning new doors and security measures would be added. This meant their carefully planned escape route would be blocked. Realizing they had to act quickly, they decided to execute their escape that night. During the night, they sneaked out of their cells and made their way to the workshop. Matthew went ahead to secure the route through the red-locked doors, while Keith and Andrew followed with the ladder pieces. Everything seemed to be going according to plan until they reached the third door, which wouldn't open. Desperate, Matthew used all his strength to force the lock open, and it finally gave way. They quickly assembled the ladder at the outer wall, but as they were about to climb, they heard a guard and a dog approaching. They hid in the darkness, terrified as the dog sniffed around them. As they thought they were caught, the guard called the dog back, and they managed to escape. They cut through the barbed wire and climbed over the concrete wall using the ladder. Once outside, they ran towards the island's airstrip, hoping to steal a small plane and escape. However, when they reached the airstrip, they found only one guard on duty. They managed to sneak past him and tried to start a plane, but it wouldn't work. Realizing they were running out of time, Matthew suggested they find a boat and escape by sea. They ran towards the docks, but as they approached, they saw police lights in the distance. In a desperate attempt to escape, Matthew jumped into the freezing water, but a police officer followed him and arrested him. Matthew was taken back to the prison, where he was placed in solitary confinement and treated for hypothermia. Despite his failed escape, Matthew's determination never wavered. In 2011, he was finally released from prison, along with Andrew. Keith, however, remained imprisoned. Matthew's story began with a poor decision by a teenager who didn't know how to cope with his psychological struggles. If he had sought help, his life might not have been destroyed in such a tragic way. This is the end of the story. If you're enjoying these stories as much as I love sharing them, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. In 1980, the residents of the area woke up to the sound of a very loud scream and the screeching of a car braking. Everyone rushed out of their homes to see what had happened, only to be shocked by the sight of a 12-year-old boy named Frank, lying in front of them, drenched in blood after being hit by a neighbor's car. The neighbor had also broken the boy's bicycle But that wasn't the real problem. The real issue was that the boy who died, Frank, was the son of the most notorious mafia boss, so feared that he was known as the butcher of the mafia. So, what exactly happened? Let's continue the story. It all began on October 27, 1940, when John Gotti was born in America as the fifth of 13 siblings in a poor family. With so many children, life was incredibly tough, and it was almost inevitable that the kids would end up on the streets of New York. And that's exactly what happened. When John Gotti reached his teenage years, he decided to run away from his family and seek his fortune in the streets of New York. Naturally, he was always looking for quick gains, and the only skills he had were his ability to run fast and the knife he always carried, which he used to threaten people and steal their money. But he had another hobby: stealing cars and trucks. He would go to the road, stop cars or trucks, and threaten the drivers until he stole their vehicles and fled. Despite being a teenager, he was incredibly bold, as we'll see in the upcoming details. The problem was that he didn't care about any punches or stabs he delivered to anyone who refused to obey his orders, till one day something happened that would change the course of his life. While John was stealing, he noticed another thief was also at work. Both were doing their job, but John realized the other thief was with his gang. However, John, as you know, was fearless. When the second thief ordered him to hand over everything he had stolen, John didn't care at all. A fight broke out between the two, each wielding their knives. John wasn't concerned about the rest of the gang with the second thief. Even if they ganged up on him, he didn't care. One of the gang members approached the two, but they were surprised when the gang stopped the fight and took both of them to their boss. John was shocked to discover that the person he was fighting was a member of a very powerful gang in America, the Gambino family, which was considered one of the top 5 mafia families in the world at the time. In fact, the origins of these 5 families were Italian, as many Italians were immigrating to America during that period. But with the influx of gangs and criminals from Italy, crime began to rise in the streets of New York and America in general. This led to the 5 mafia families forming a committee called the Commission, organized by the godfather of the mafia, Lucky Luciano, whom I talked about in a previous video on the channel. After the commission was formed, all criminal operations became coordinated, especially among the 5 Italian mafia families, the most famous of which was the Gambino family. The Gambino family had started their mafia operations back in Italy in 1910, and since then, their influence had grown, with their gang expanding to over 1,000 members spread across various locations outside of Italy. The gang continued to grow, and people began to fear them more and more. The gang's members were everywhere, infiltrating every organization and project in the country. The Gambino family had power, weapons, and influence to the point where they could turn America's streets into a bloodbath, all while making millions and billions of dollars. And now, standing before them was the teenage John Gotti, who had just fought with one of their members. As you might expect, a teenager like John, with no one to back him up, had just fought and injured a member of one of the biggest Italian mafia families in America. His fate seemed sealed. Death, too. But something strange happened. Della Croce, the boss of the Gambino family, noticed everything that had happened and saw John's skills in stealing. He offered John 2 choices, with no third option. John's decision would determine the rest of his life: either die now or have his life completely changed. Della Croce gave him 2 options: either be killed on the spot or be given a task. If he succeeded, Della Croce would consider him his son from that day forward. Literally, he offered to make John his son and give him power, influence, and become his right-hand man in the most powerful mafia family in America. It's worth noting that to join the mafia, one had to complete a difficult task, whether it was a robbery or a murder. Failure was not an option, as it would result in death. So, what was the task Della Croce gave to the teenage John? At the time, Della Croce's nephew and close friend had been killed by an Irish Mafia gang. This gang was very powerful, and they knew all of Della Croce's men. For such a sensitive mission, Della Croce needed someone new to the Mafia, someone whose face wasn't known in their world. That's why he gave the task to John Gotti, asking him to go and kill the man who had killed his nephew. This all happened in 1973, and it was considered the first operation in the life of the future Mafia boss, John Gotti. With all his boldness, John took a gun with him to carry out the mission. But the strange thing was that he refused to take anyone with him. He wanted to do it alone. After that, he began hunting the son of the Irish Mafia boss. His name was James. John waited outside a restaurant until James came out drunk and unaware of anything. John then took him to a remote location where he shot him 6 times, ensuring his life was over. The problem was that there were eyewitnesses who saw him carrying out the operation. He was accused and arrested, but no one could prove the murder charge. He was only convicted of theft, as he admitted to stealing, but nothing more. He was sentenced to 7 years in prison. But thanks to the power and influence of Della Croce, he was released after only 2 years. From then on, a new chapter began in the life of John Gotti, the new member of the Gambino family in New York. He was only 20 years old at the time. Della Croce was impressed with John's personality, even though John often broke the gang's rules and orders. To Della Croce, John was like honey to his heart, and he always defended him. John didn't waste this opportunity. Instead, he began to flaunt it in front of everyone, walking around with bodyguards and drawing attention wherever he went. People looked at him as if he were a famous celebrity, but everyone knew he was John Gotti, the right-hand man of the Gambino family boss. Every time he went out, he dressed in the most luxurious clothes, and photographers would rush to take his picture and interview him. He loved the attention, as it made him appear as the official spokesperson for the Gambino family. However, this would later create many enemies within the gang itself. Many people began to resent him for how quickly he had risen to power and become so close to the boss, taking on such a high position as the right-hand man. Others felt they were more deserving of that role. Additionally, his constant interactions with the media, acting as the official spokesperson, or even as the boss himself, began to irritate many of the older members of the gang. When Della Croce, the boss of the Gambino family, held meetings, he did so in his large house, which he called the White House. He did this to show off his power, even suggesting that he was stronger than the President of the United States himself. The house was heavily guarded, and Della Croce made sure that any business conducted in the country had to go through him, with the share of the profits going to him, whether willingly or by force. This allowed him to make billions of dollars annually. However, the 5 mafia families had established a new system called the Commission, led by Lucky Luciano, the head of the Mafia. This system made drug trafficking off limits for the Gambino family, as it was the business of 2 other Mafia families. But as I mentioned earlier, John Gotti began to break the rules more than ever, especially regarding drug trafficking. He started dealing in secret, even though it was forbidden for his family. He began building his own drug business, making secret profits. However, this wouldn't be easy, especially since it was prohibited for the entire family. When the secret leaked to other members of the gang, they immediately reported it to the boss. Della Croce quickly summoned John and warned him to stop, speaking to him calmly and kindly, since he was his right-hand man. John began to slow down his drug operations, making them even more secretive than before. Meanwhile, he started working on another skill he had always loved: stealing cars. But this time, he did it with even more boldness and strength. Now that He had the power, he did. He no longer settled for simple street fights. Instead, he sought brutal revenge against anyone who crossed him, even going as far as cutting their flesh into pieces. No one dared to speak against him, despite his charming appearance and stylish clothing. Inside, he was a terrifying killer. However, this didn't stop him from having enemies who hated him deeply, like his neighbor, Fabi, who despised John, his wife, and his children. Fabi would often give them strange looks, which bothered John's wife so much that she asked John to teach him a lesson or make him stop. But John didn't care, as Fabi was just a neighbor and an ordinary person with no value to him. Until one day, a major disaster occurred that changed everything and further increased John's power, making everyone fear him even more. On March 12, 1980, John's 12-year-old son, Frank Gotti, was playing in the street in the morning when Fabi, the neighbor who hated the family, sped up his car and hit the poor boy who was riding his bicycle. The impact threw the boy forward, ending his life. Everyone woke up to the sound of the car's brakes and the boy's scream. People rushed out to see what had happened, and John and his wife came out to find their son dead on the street. Everyone began to mourn when they realized it was John Gotti's son. The strange thing was that Fabi, the neighbor, was terrified and kept apologizing, swearing it was an accident. Out of fear of John Gotti, he turned himself in to the police, knowing that he was as good as dead. No matter where he hid, John would hunt him down and take revenge. When the police asked John if he was accusing Fabi of killing his son, John surprisingly replied, "No, it was just an accident. My son died naturally." At this point, Fabi was certain he would die a horrible death and would be tortured until John took his revenge. Fabi lived in constant fear, always looking over his shoulder wherever he went. He even chose to eat in crowded public places so that he would be in front of people's eyes, making it harder for anyone to kill him. But he was still terrified, until one morning, John Gotti took his wife and traveled to Florida. Time passed, but his wife kept asking John to avenge their son. In reality, no one knew what was going on in John's mind. He only traveled after a month had passed since the incident to make people think he had moved on and forgotten about it. But in reality, his trip was just an excuse to be absent. One night, after Fabi had finally relaxed, thinking nothing would happen to him and even traveled to another country, John's gang kidnapped him. That was the last time anyone saw Mr. Fabi. The gang tortured him in every possible way, using guns, knives, and any other means of torture. In the end, after all the torture, Fabi's life ended and his body was dismembered and disappeared. In truth, no one knew what happened to him, whether he was alive or dead, or where he was. When his family realized he was missing, they reported it to the police, who questioned John about it. John simply said, "No, I was in Florida. I wasn't here." And with that, he continued his work as if nothing had happened. After avenging his son, he moved on, and his power, influence, and strength continued to grow. But as his power grew, so did his enemies, especially within the gang, where people resented the authority and strength he wielded. Until one day, something changed that turned everything upside down for John, and tensions began to rise within the gang. This all happened in 1982 when Della Croce, the boss of the Gambino family, died at him. With his death, the protection and power that had been placed over John were removed. The big boss who had always defended him was gone. The problem was that the person appointed as the new boss of the gang after Della Croce was someone named Castellano, who had a personal grudge against John and hated him deeply. However, many people believed that John, who was more famous and powerful than Castellano, deserved to be the leader of the Gambino family. John had built his own business and power, and he was always the one appearing on TV, giving interviews and talking about how his gang was full of good people who who followed the rules of the commission. He even claimed they punished those who broke the rules and caused trouble in the streets, making them seem like heroes who maintained peace. Throughout this time, John had built good relationships with important people and politicians. Unlike his relationship with the gang's boss, which was deteriorating, John often broke the rules and orders of Castellano, and his secret drug business not only caused problems with Castellano, but also with other mafia families. As you know, the business was divided among the families, and drug trafficking belonged to other mafia families. The next step was clear. One of the two had to eliminate the other to take control of the Gambino family. This step fell to the faster and more cunning person, who was none other than John Gotti. He quietly planned and coordinated everything in his mind, making this the step or leap to becoming the new boss of the Gambino family. How did he do it? On December 16, 1985, John sent 4 of his strongest men to wait outside the restaurant where Castellano, the boss of the Gambino family, was having dinner with a friend. After the friend left, Castellano got into his car to leave, but he was surprised to find his driver with him. In reality, his life ended right there, and the crime shook the streets of New York. People were shocked to see the boss of the Gambino family lying in a pool of blood, along with his driver and their car, riddled with bullets. No one, not even the police, knew who had committed the crime, but the Gambino family knew very well that only John could have done it. The person who had just killed the boss of the Gambino family was someone who had a history of problems with him, and this step was expected by even the lowest members of the gang. A month later, after the funeral and mourning ceremonies for Castellano, John Gotti met with the other important members of the gang, the leaders, to appoint himself as the new boss. This happened because he had built friendships with the leaders by involving them in his drug business, which brought them gold. As for the other members of the gang who weren't convinced by John's words, they were convinced by his strength and weapons. In the same year, 1985, John Gotti was appointed as the boss of the largest mafia family in New York, the Gambino family. From there, his journey in the history of the Mafia began, and he became very famous. People even nicknamed him the Dapper Don because of his always impeccable style and the bodyguards surrounding him wherever he went, to the point that anyone who wanted to take a picture with him or interview him had to first pay $3,000 to the gang. John continued to exercise his power, engaged in his drug business, and didn't care about anyone. But now, after what he had done to Castellano, he didn't consider that Castellano had been a close friend of the other 4 major mafia bosses in the commission. What John had done would have serious consequences later from the other mafia families who refused to recognize him as the boss of the Gambino family after he killed their friend Castellano. They always said that before they could recognize him as the mafia boss, they needed to study the matter carefully. But in reality, they were plotting together to take revenge on John by killing him. The problem was that John was smart and always took hidden steps forward, and no one knew what he was thinking. The solution was to keep him under surveillance. 24/7, the 4 bosses appointed someone named Anthony to plan and eliminate John. Anthony kept watching John, trying to figure out his next move and where he would go, till the right opportunity presented itself in 1986. Anthony found out that John would be going out with his deputy named Frank and driving Frank's car, which was parked under Frank's house. Anthony quickly grabbed a digital bomb from the storage and rushed to Frank's car, attaching the bomb underneath. But luckily for John, he hadn't yet gotten into the car. The person who got in was his deputy, Frank, and the car exploded in front of him. The police arrived and began investigating, wanting to know who had planted the bomb, but they didn't know. Although John was very upset about the death of his friend Frank, he knew that this was an assassination attempt targeting him, not Frank. He immediately thought that the 4 major mafia bosses were trying to take revenge on him for killing Castellano. So he began to plan and study all aspects of the situation. His main concern wasn't that he was now competing with the 4 major mafia bosses in New York. In reality, the situation could escalate into a war at any moment, with blood spilled everywhere, but he didn't care. What mattered to him was power and influence, and remaining the boss. If he ignored the situation, it would be seen as a sign of weakness. So he began to confront them and seek revenge. But first, he needed to find the person who had bombed the car and take revenge for his friend. After a long search, he discovered that the person who had carried out the operation was a member of a gang called the Lucchese family, which was one of the 4 major mafia families. The person's name was Anthony, and John began to gather all the necessary information about him. He found out that Anthony was conducting illegal operations in secret to make money behind his gang's back. He always brought in other people to help him, like his cousin or friends. John's plan was to send his men to Anthony's cousin's house, threaten him, and make him call Anthony, telling him that there was a new operation and they needed to meet at a specific location to plan it. Of course, Anthony would come, feeling safe and happy, thinking he was about to carry out a new operation and make a lot of money. He went to the location his cousin had told him about, waiting in his car, eating ice cream, feeling happy. But instead of his cousin arriving, a black car pulled up beside him and several guns pointed at him from the windows. The gang inside the black car began shooting at him. Luckily, Anthony hid under the car's dashboard and miraculously survived the attack, taking 3 bullets in his body. After recovering, he knew that the people who had tried to kill him were members of the Gambino family who wanted to take revenge on him. Now, he also wanted revenge, but he needed the help of his gang. It seemed like a major war was coming. What happened next, and who would prevail in this bloody war? Let's continue. At this time, another force emerged that would change the dynamics. The power of the commission was considered nullified because crime was increasing in the streets, and its laws were no longer effective. Bombs began to explode in the streets, and many innocent people became victims. The police began to take action, trying to catch up and save the innocent people who were dying. They demanded interrogations of the most famous mafia bosses in America at the time, including the 5 most prominent bosses, one of whom was John Gotti. The situation was tense from all sides. But this didn't stop the mafia from bribing the police to make the investigations easier. However, this didn't work with all the police officers. At the same time, there were police officers who had previously been members of the mafia, and their primary loyalty was to the gangs they came from. 2 of these officers were named Sims and Paul, and they were members of the Lucchese family, the same gang Anthony belonged to. Anthony spoke to them and asked for their help in eliminating John and his men who had tried to kill him. Anthony began describing the person who had shot at him from the black car, and Sims and Paul were able to identify the person who turned out to be a strong member of John's gang named Haddel. Haddel was someone John relied on for special revenge and assassination missions. Anthony asked the corrupt police officers to investigate and find out where Haddel was. The police were able to locate him, and instead of summoning him, they kidnapped him and took him to Anthony, who began torturing him and interrogating him to confess the name of the person who had sent him to kill Anthony. After extensive torture, Haddel initially remained silent, but eventually confessed that John had sent him to kill Anthony and was planning to eliminate the entire Lucchese family. After learning this, Anthony ended Haddel's life with multiple gunshots, leaving him in a pool of blood. He then ordered Sims and Paul to carry out a new operation to take out John's new right-hand man, a man named Chico. The 2 officers used their authority as police officers, wearing their uniforms and driving their police car at night, following Chico's car. They followed him until they reached an empty road where they turned on their sirens to pull him over under the pretext that he was speeding. Chico pulled over to the side, thinking they were real police officers, and rolled down his window to hand over his license. But as soon as the window was down, he was met with 3 gunshots to his head, leaving him in a pool of blood. The officers then drove away, but the problem was that they didn't notice the 3 eyewitnesses who had. I've seen everything that happened on the street that night. Connolly, the witnesses immediately went to the police and reported what they had seen. They even spoke to the press, and the news began to spread everywhere that the police were now considered useless and the Mafia was in control of the country. The innocent citizens were terrified, feeling that no one could protect them after what had happened with the police. The situation began to spiral out of control, with protests breaking out among the people. At this point, John saw an opportunity to regain control after his reputation and power had taken a hit due to the ongoing events. After the protests began in the streets, John decided to make a surprising move. Seeing his popularity declining, he appeared before the people to reassure them, announcing that he was ready to make peace with the other Mafia bosses. He declared that he was willing to give up his right to seek revenge for the person who had been killed, who was close to him, in exchange for the other bosses also giving up their claims, and for the situation to calm down between them. The Tess move was actually very clever because he announced it in front of everyone, putting the other bosses in a difficult position. If they refused, it would look bad for them, and they wouldn't be able to kill him after he had made such a public announcement. The second goal for John was to appear as the hero in front of everyone, showing that he still had great popularity. Additionally, many people had started to turn against him, and he wasn't ready to fight all of them at once. Therefore, he needed to calm the situation and make a small sacrifice, but no one knew the thoughts going on inside his mind. In reality, this move would lead to the downfall of all the Mafia families. Okay, how did this happen after what John had done? He appeared before the people as a hero, but at the same time, the federal police were gathering the Mafia bosses to begin interrogations about the crimes that had been committed. John was setting up other people, bribing them to confess to the crimes and exonerate him, making himself appear as the victimized hero in the midst of all this chaos. Meanwhile, the federal police saw him as a criminal and were trying to pin everything on him, okay? But thanks to his sharp intelligence and brilliant plan, the federal police couldn't prove anything against him. He was the only one who walked out of the courtroom declaring his innocence, while the other bosses remained under investigation. When John left the courtroom, he did so in full style and elegance, with everyone taking his picture and requesting interviews. He was truly seen as a hero, but he refused most of the interview requests. The federal police were still trying to gather evidence to convict him, so they began monitoring his friends. John knew that all eyes would be on him for a while, which is why, after the investigation, he acted completely normal, going out to eat and appearing in public, knowing that people were definitely watching him. After some time, the federal police noticed that he was meeting with his gang at a specific restaurant. The problem was that this restaurant was located in a very poor neighborhood, which didn't suit John Gotti's status. When the police realized that these meetings were happening repeatedly, they became convinced that something was going on in that small, poor restaurant. They decided to plant audio recording devices or spy equipment inside the restaurant to eavesdrop on the conversations between John and his gang, especially since they noticed that the gang met there every day. But the problem was that when they reviewed the recordings from the previous night, they were shocked to find that the voices were completely drowned out by the music playing in the background and the loud noise in the restaurant. Even when they tried to enhance the audio, they couldn't make out anything. This was a major problem because it was now impossible for them to record the gang's conversations at any time due to the music and noise in the restaurant. They needed to find a way to make the gang meet somewhere else. The federal police, who were monitoring the situation and trying to spy on the gang, began to think of a plan. They decided that as soon as the gang started gathering, they would create a disturbance or commotion in the restaurant to force the gang to move to another location where they could be monitored more easily. But they didn't need to do this because they discovered the real secret. The gang wasn't actually meeting in the restaurant. The restaurant was just a front, a gateway to a secret location where the gang held their meetings. This became clear when they noticed that every time the gang entered the restaurant, an old woman would come out of the two-story house next to the restaurant. After the gang left the restaurant, the woman would return to her house. The police then realized that the gang was using a secret passage from the restaurant to the house to hold their meetings. The old woman would come out only after the gang had gathered inside. The police began monitoring the old woman closely, and when they noticed that she had left the house to go shopping, a group of police officers quickly entered the house and installed listening devices in every room. This was the beginning of the end for John and his gang, as well as the other 5 Mafia families. So, what happened next? The police waited for the next meeting to begin listening to the conversations that would send John to his doom. Not only was he talking about the crimes he had committed in the past, but he was also planning future operations against others. He even plotted revenge against the police themselves. He had no idea that they were listening to him at that very moment. Imagine one of the federal police officers hearing John say his name and that he wanted to cut his throat. After all the confessions recorded from John and his gang, it was enough to send him to prison for the rest of his life. In December 1989, John was arrested. But the strange thing was that when the police arrested him, he remained completely calm with an unnatural confidence. He even looked at the officer handcuffing him and said, "You won't be able to prove anything, and I'll be out soon." But when he went to court, he was shocked to find that the recordings of him talking with his gang were being played. The investigations continued for a year and a half, during which John denied all the charges against him, speaking with such confidence that he made others, including the police and the court, doubt his guilt. He even justified the brutal crimes he had committed, claiming he was defending the city and its innocent people, eliminating the evil ones. He made up stories and tales with the recordings in the courtroom, which captured his voice talking about his crimes in such a brutal manner, and even wanting to kill a federal police officer were enough to convict him. In the end, his close friends and gang members who had been arrested began to confess against him, and he also started confessing against the higher-ups in the Mafia and the other bosses. In reality, as the saying goes, you either die a hero or live long enough to see yourself become the villain. But at the same time, another disaster struck one of the 5 Mafia families in 1991. The Brooklyn Massacre occurred, lasting 4 months and resulting in the deaths of 40 people in the streets of Brooklyn. This massacre was carried out by the Colombo family, one of the 5 Mafia families, and it was all orchestrated by one person, John Gotti, after he had confessed against the other Mafia bosses. The boss of the Colombo family was arrested, and the gang began fighting over who would become the new boss. The gang split into 2 factions, each supporting a different person, and the conflict led to killings in the streets of Brooklyn. When the police decided to arrest the entire gang, the 2 men fighting for leadership ended up killing each other. The police arrested one of them and began interrogating him, and he confessed against the others. Even when they arrested Anthony, he began confessing the names of the corrupt police officers he had been working with to carry out crimes for the Mafia. For the 5 Mafia bosses, each was sentenced to life in prison. The first among them was John Gotti, who tried to reduce his sentence by confessing against others and revealing secrets. But instead, 60 additional charges were added to his sentence for murder, kidnapping, and the crimes he had confessed to. In a final desperate attempt, John began to say that he wished he had chosen a better path in life. But it was clear that life had chosen his path for him from the moment he was born, poor among 13 siblings, struggling to survive. But as we often say, even if life chooses the path for you, it's up to you to walk it. John chose to continue down the path of brutality to the point where the death of his own son didn't make him reconsider his choices. Instead, he became even stronger and continued on this path until the end. John Gotti died in his prison cell alone after suffering from throat cancer for a long time without any treatment. It was as if he was paying for the crimes he had committed, the bodies he had dismembered, and the lives he had destroyed. And that's the story of one of the many tales of the Mafia. Hey, if you're enjoying these stories as much as I love sharing them, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. The heists were always carried out in one of those ways, whether it was digging, threats, using explosives, or something else to break into a vault. Okay, but today's story is different. Today's story is about a barber who decided to pull off a heist in his own home without even unlocking a door. Without digging, without anything in, he stole $1 million. Our story begins in Chicago, USA, with a barber named William. Smart. William was a barber by day, but he had another job by night. He was a thief. Every time he'd steal from houses, car shops, or anything that came his way to make a mark. In the morning, he'd return to his barbershop. Even though he was famous and made a lot of money from his barbering, most of the time, he carried out these thefts alone. Occasionally, his brother would help him, especially for bigger jobs or when he wanted to rob a bank. After robbing several small banks in the city where they lived in Chicago, his brother suggested they use their experience to pull off a big heist somewhere a bit farther away. They sat down and started thinking about the conditions the ideal bank would need to meet for them to make a huge profit. They made a list of criteria and started searching for the perfect bank. Among the conditions, the bank had to have lacked security, not too high-tech, and hold a lot of money. They searched for a long time until they finally found the perfect bank for their operation, a bank that met all their criteria. After agreeing, the first thing they did was go to the bank and open an account there. At the same time, they rented a small safe deposit box, a locker in the middle of the vault, where the larger safe deposit boxes were. Naturally, they didn't use their real names or documents. They used fake identities to avoid being recognized. They made sure to act like big shots, always going to that vault, coming and going, getting to know the employees. They made it seem normal, so no one would suspect them when they came and went frequently. The operation began. The bank had all the specifications they wanted. After agreeing on the plan, the first thing they did was go to the bank and open an account there. At the same time, they rented a small safe deposit box, a locker in the middle of the vault, where the larger safe deposit boxes were. Naturally, they didn't use their real names or documents. They used fake identities to avoid being recognized. They made sure to act like big shots, always going to that vault, coming and going, getting to know the employees. They made it seem normal, so no one would suspect them when they came and went frequently. They even befriended the lady who always handled their safe deposit box, chatting with her, especially William's brother, who got along well with her. They needed to gain her sympathy and look for any vulnerabilities in the bank's security, or even in the human element, the employees. Over time, they noticed all the little details about the bank's security system, how it worked, and understood it well. Sometimes, the lady would repeat certain things to them, showing that the bank was safe and that there was nothing to fear. William and his brother considered the possibility that the vulnerability might come from the human factor and decided to use social engineering. They befriended the lady, gaining her trust, and planned to use her to help them rob the bank. The lady, who had grown close to them, even told William, "Don't worry about this bank. If we want to take money, we can just come after hours, or open the safe deposit box. The box won't open if you don't have the key or the code. Even if you have the key and the code, the box won't open until the next day. And on Saturdays, the service stops in the morning, so if you close the box, it won't open until Monday. She explained that to open the box, you needed 3 things: the key, the code, and the time. Without all 3, it was impossible to open the box. William and his brother realized that the bank didn't track who left the vault, only who entered. This was the vulnerability they would exploit. William and his brother began to execute their plan. They had gathered all the information they needed. The lady had given them all the details, and they knew exactly how to proceed. William's brother had even suggested that they use the safe deposit box to hide their tools for the heist. They started bringing in the materials, little by little, hiding them in the safe deposit box. The materials weren't too large because the box wasn't very big, but they managed to fit everything they needed. William had decided to stay in the vault for a long time, so he needed to find a way to solve the problem of hiding larger materials. He discovered that the vault had a false ceiling, and if he moved one of the panels, he could reach the space above and hide the larger tools and equipment there. He gathered everything he needed, and, like every time, his brother stayed outside the vault, waiting for him. William entered the vault, hid in the space above, and waited for the right moment to start the heist. He had all the tools and equipment he needed, and he was ready to stay there for 2 days if necessary. When he finally emerged, it was dark, and he had brought a flashlight to help him see during the operation. He began to work slowly and carefully, making sure not to damage the safe deposit boxes. He opened each box one by one, taking whatever he found, cash, gold, or anything valuable. He wasn't picky. He took everything he could, trying to maximize his haul without leaving any traces. Sometimes he'd find boxes with nothing but credit card statements, and he'd leave them alone. He felt like Robin Hood, stealing from the rich to give to the poor. He worked through the night, taking breaks to eat and rest. He had to stay calm and composed, even though at any moment someone could open the vault and find him. He spent the entire weekend in the vault, working tirelessly. By Sunday night, he had opened about 70 or 80 boxes and decided it was time to stop. He began to clean up, hiding all the evidence and returning everything to its place. He made sure that nothing looked out of order, and then he returned to his hiding spot to rest. On Monday morning, the bank opened as usual, and the lady who handled the safe deposit boxes came in. She opened the vault, and William waited for the right moment to make his escape. He had a small mirror on a stick that he used to check if anyone was in the vault. Once he confirmed that it was empty, he emerged from his hiding spot and made his way out. He had 4 bags of loot with him, and he left the bank unnoticed. He met up with his brother, who was waiting in the car, and they drove away. The operation was a success, and William had stolen over $1 million. It took a long time before the bank discovered the heist. One day, a customer tried to open their safe deposit box and found that the lock had been tampered with. They checked all the boxes and found that many of them had been emptied. They called the police, who launched an investigation to find any evidence that could lead them to the culprit, but they found nothing, no fingerprints, no clues, nothing. The only thing they found was a watch that had been left in the false ceiling. It was the only piece of evidence they had, but it wasn't enough to solve the case. The investigation remained open for a long time. A year later, in Chicago, a man entered a bank and went up to the ceiling. A panel from the false ceiling fell, and the security guard noticed something moving. They called the police, who arrived and found William hiding in the ceiling. They didn't know he was the one behind the previous heist, but they noticed that the materials he had with him were similar to those used in the previous robbery. They also found the watch, which matched the one from the first heist. They realized that William was the same person who had attempted another bank robbery a month and a half earlier. They had found the same materials and the same tools in both cases. The police finally had enough evidence to connect William to the first heist. They brought him in for questioning, and he eventually confessed. He explained how he had carried out the first heist and where he had hidden the money. In the end, he was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Because of his actions, the laws regarding bank security in the United States were changed. Thus, it became illegal to have false ceilings in bank vaults, and the security measures were tightened. William's heist had a lasting impact on the banking industry. Hey, if you're enjoying these stories as much as I love sharing them, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. Notorious gang was terrorizing the city of Detroit, Michigan. This gang had a chilling modus operandi. They would break into homes dressed as police officers, complete with tactical gear and bulletproof vests. Their usual targets were the homes of drug dealers and rival gang members. When they stormed a house, the criminals inside would mistake them for real cops, so they wouldn't resist. Over time, the gang's operations grew more violent and brazen, eventually catching the attention of the FBI. The Bureau stepped in to uncover the identities of those behind this audacious gang, and what they discovered was far more shocking than anyone could have anticipated. The FBI wasn't sure at the time, were these just criminals disguised as cops, or were they actual corrupt police officers? This is a story of crime, deception, and a high-stakes game of cat and mouse. So buckle up, because this is a first-class police thriller filled with gripping twists, intense chases, and revelations that will leave you on the edge of your seat. Our story begins in the 1990s. In the heart of Detroit, Michigan, a city known for its dangerous neighborhoods where drug trafficking, violence, theft, and murder were rampant. Despite the efforts of local law enforcement, it was nearly impossible to completely eradicate these crimes due to the sheer number of gangs operating in the area. So the best the police could do was try to keep things from spiraling out of control. But then, something unusual started happening. Homes were being broken into, seemingly at random, or at least that's how it appeared at first. However, police soon noticed a pattern. Many of the reports they received described a gang breaking into homes while dressed in police uniforms and tactical gear. One such incident occurred in February 1994. The gang targeted a house in an area known for drug trafficking. The residents were used to police raids, as law enforcement would occasionally storm the homes of drug dealers. The gang members, dressed in full police gear with vests labeled police, armed with heavy weapons and wearing masks, stormed the house, shouting, "We're the police. Get down. Don't move." The man inside, a drug dealer, initially refused to cooperate, thinking they were real cops. But when the gang members grew violent and even fired a shot near his head, he caved and showed them where he had hidden his money inside the couch cushions. The gang took the cash and fled, leaving the man in shock. It was only later that he realized they weren't real police and reported the incident. The real police arrived, took his statement, and noted the gang's description. They were puzzled because no official police operation had been authorized for that house. This was just one of many similar break-ins reported across Detroit. Almost every week, there were reports of a gang dressed as police, storming homes, threatening residents at gunpoint, and stealing cash, valuables, and sometimes even drugs. Most of the targeted homes belonged to drug dealers, but not always. Sometimes the gang would target ordinary people, including elderly individuals and women, treating them with the same brutality they showed to criminals. This gang wasn't noble. They weren't just targeting criminals, They were after money, and they didn't care who got hurt in the process. As the gang's operations escalated, the police realized they needed to form a special task force to handle the situation. This task force included detectives from the Detroit Police Department and agents from the FBI. Together, they began investigating the gang, trying to uncover their identities. Initially, the investigators noticed that the gang's methods closely resembled those of real police or SWAT teams. They weren't just wearing police uniforms, they were mimicking police tactics during their raids. This led the investigators to suspect that the gang might include former or corrupt police officers. However, after extensive research, they ruled out this possibility. Even corrupt cops would avoid such blatant and violent crimes to avoid drawing attention. The task force faced a major challenge. Most of the gang's victims were drug dealers or criminals themselves, making them reluctant to cooperate with the police. However, the investigators assured them that their only concern was taking down the gang, not prosecuting small-time drug dealers. Slowly, some of the victims began to share information, but it wasn't much. The gang members were extremely careful, leaving no trace behind and ensuring no one saw their faces. The break-ins continued and the violence escalated. In one particularly disturbing incident, the gang broke into the home of an elderly woman, mistakenly thinking it was a drug dealer's house. They interrogated her, demanding to know where she hid her drugs and money, but she couldn't answer. They broke her arm before leaving her traumatized. In another case, they assaulted a mother and her daughter. These attacks on innocent people fueled the investigators' determination to bring the gang to justice. The task force considered the possibility that the gang members might be current or former police officers. Given their tactics, they investigated officers who had been dismissed for corruption or other offenses, especially those who had worked on drug-related cases. However, they found no evidence linking any officers to the gang. The investigators concluded that the gang was likely composed of career criminals with no ties to law enforcement. The breakthrough came on July 26, 1994, when the police received a report of a shootout. When they arrived, they found a man shot multiple times and lying on the ground. He was dressed in police gear, wearing a mask, and armed with a high-powered handgun capable of piercing bulletproof vests. The man, later identified as Dante Garrison, was rushed to the hospital. The investigators hoped he would survive, as he might be the key to unraveling the gang's operations. When Dante regained consciousness, he agreed to cooperate with the police in exchange for immunity. He revealed that he was a member of the gang and provided crucial information about its structure and operations. Dante explained that the gang was much larger than the investigators had initially thought, with around 30 members. However, only 4 to 8 members participated in each raid. The gang was led by 2 men, Obi Carter, the mastermind who planned the operations, and Andre Woods, the enforcer who led the raids. Andre was a violent man who enjoyed torturing his victims, especially women. The gang was highly organized, with members receiving equal shares of the loot from each raid to prevent internal conflicts. With Dante's help, the task force identified most of the gang members and began monitoring their activities. They also obtained wiretaps to listen in on the gang's conversations, gathering evidence to build a strong case. The investigators planned to arrest the gang members during one of their raids, catching them in the act. On November 11, 1994, the task force received word that the gang was planning a major operation. The police set up surveillance and followed the gang as they carried out their raid. However, when the police moved in to arrest them, the gang managed to escape in their van, leading to a high-speed chase through the streets of Detroit. During the chase, the gang members fired at the pursuing officers, who returned fire. In the chaos, one of the gang members, Obi Carter, was shot and killed. 2 others were arrested, while 3 managed to escape. The police later raided several of the gang's hideouts, recovering stolen goods, weapons, and police gear. With the evidence they had gathered, along with the confessions of the arrested gang members, the task force was able to arrest a total of 29 individuals. All were convicted and sentenced to prison, bringing an end to the gang's reign of terror. Remarkably, despite the violent confrontations, not a single police officer was injured during the operation. It seemed that the gang, for all their bravado, were only tough when facing unarmed civilians. When confronted by real law enforcement, they crumbled. And so, we come to the end of this gripping tale. Hey, if you're enjoying these stories as much as I love sharing them, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. In a time when laws were mere ink on paper and the streets held the true power, there whispered a name everyone knew but dared not speak aloud. A name that built an empire from nothing, an empire founded on blood, fear, and insatiable greed. Capone. Imagine a simple boy, his father, a humble Italian immigrant. They had no wealth, no status, yet this boy possessed an ambition that dwarfed the very streets he grew up in. An ambition that would etch his name into every alley, every speakeasy in Chicago. Al Capone wasn't just a mob boss. He was anything far more cunning, far more dangerous. From the clandestine species peddling illicit liquor to the very pillars of power, the Palisade, the courts, everyone seemed to dance to his tune. But how did he ascend Tassac Heights? What was the secret that always kept him one step ahead? As they say, greed is a man's greatest enemy. Capone, who seemingly held everything within his grasp, suddenly found tables turning. Those he trusted betrayed him. The city that once hailed him as its king now hunted him relentlessly. His questing then becomes not just how Capone built his empire, but how it crumbled, and the price he paid for the life he led. This isn't just another gangster story, a mere chronicle of crimes and body counts. It's the story of a man who forget his own legend, only to become lost in its shadows. Prepare yourselves, for what you're about to hear is not just a story, but a testament to avarice, treachery, and the downfall of one of history's most notorious figures. But this is just the beginning. Many tales remain untold, secrets buried deep in mysteries that boggled the mind. How did it all begin? Who aided his rise? And what ultimately led to his downfall? Stay with me, and you'll uncover the complete saga from the first bullet fired to his final days behind bars. Because what's to come is not just a story, but a puzzle. A reality more captivating than fiction. Once upon a time, laws were mere ink on paper, and the streets ruled supreme. There was a name everyone whispered, but no one dared to speak louder. Name that forged an empire out of nothing. An empire built on blood, fear, and greed. The name Capone. Picture this, a young boy, ordinary, the son of a simple Italian immigrant. They had no wealth, no status, but this boy had a dream far bigger than the streets he grew up in. A dream that would etch his name into every alley, every corner of Chicago. Capone wasn't just a gang leader. He was smarter, more dangerous than that dot from speakeasies, selling bootlegged liquor to the police and courts. Everyone worked for him. But how did he rise to such heights? What was the secret that always kept him one step ahead? They say greed is man's greatest enemy. Capone, who once had everything in his grasp, suddenly found the tables turning. Those he trusted betrayed him, and the city that once crowned him king now hunted him. But the question isn't just how Capone built his empire, it's how it crumbled. Matisse, what price did he pay to live this life? This isn't just the tale of an ordinary mob boss or a string of crimes in numbers. This is the story of a man who crafted his own legend with his hands and lost himself in it. Prepare yourselves, because what you're about to hear isn't just a story, it's a testament to greed, betrayal, and the fall of one of history's most dangerous men. But this is only the beginning. There are countless untold stories, secrets, yet to surface, and mysteries beyond imagination. How did it all start? Who helped him? What led to his downfall? Stay with me as we unravel the full story from the first bullet to his final days behind bars. What's coming isn't just a tale, it's a riddle, a truth more dangerous than fiction. But before we begin, let me tell you, the narrator, and I'll guide you through every twist, every shadowy corner of this saga. If you love this kind of content and want me to keep going, I need your support. So hit that subscribe button, turn on the bell, and leave a like after the video. Now, let's dive into our story. Shall we take a trip back in time? Let's go to January 17th, 1899 in Brooklyn, New York. In that moment, a child was born, a small boy named Alphonse Gabriel Capone. He was just an ordinary kid, like any other. But who could have imagined that this boy would become one of the most feared and infamous mobsters in history? Let me paint you a picture of Capone's background. His family were Italian immigrants, specifically from Naples. His father was a barber, his mother a homemaker, and the family was poor. Imagine people who came to New York chasing the American dream, only to find a harsh life filled with hunger, violence, and crime at every corner. Capone attended a Catholic school, but he had a temper and no patience. They say that at 14, he hit his teacher. Why? Because the teacher humiliated him in front of the class. The school didn't forgive him and expelled him. From that moment, the streets became his real school. In the streets of Brooklyn, you didn't have many options, especially if you were poor. You either worked hard and lived on the edge, or you were drawn into the world of crime. Capone's first job was with small gangs, like the 5 Points Gang, which was notorious in New York at the time. He learned the basics from them: how to evade the police, how to intimidate people, how to earn their trust or eliminate them if necessary. Here, we need to imagine young Capone, sharp-witted but with no boundaries. Life wasn't easy for him, and these circumstances were the main reason he chose this path. Think about it. How could the life of a child born into a poor family in a harsh society turn him into a figure that all of America feared? The story is just beginning, and what's coming is even greater and more dangerous. Once the streets had spoken to Capone, it was time for him to take his first official step into the world of crime. This marked the beginning of a new chapter in his life, one that would separate the young boy from the mobster who would shake all of America. New York, at the time, was a city that never slept, not in its nightlife, nor in its crime. Capone was part of the 5 Points Gang, one of the most dangerous gangs in New York at the time. The gang was like a second school for him, teaching him everything: how to terrify people, how to control neighborhoods, how to enforce his own laws. But there was one thing that set Capone apart: his personality. He always wanted to be in control, the one everyone feared. This, of course, led to conflicts even within the gang itself. One day, Capone was working at a bar with Frankie Yale, a key figure in his life. Capone had a bad habit: he would make crude remarks about women. And then, the unexpected happened. Huge fight broke out between him and a man whose sister he had insulted. The fight ended with a deep scar on Capone's face, earning him the nickname Scarface. The strange thing about this story is that Capone always told people the scar was from World War I, even though he never served. But imagine that scar became a symbol of his power. People would think twice before crossing him when they saw it. Frankie Yale, the bar owner Capone worked for, wasn't just a boss, he was a mentor. He taught Capone how to assert his dominance, how to make fear his greatest weapon, and how to use violence as a tool. Frankie saw something different in Capone, a smart young man with no red lines, who knew how to seize every opportunity. And so, when Johnny Torrio, one of Chicago's top mobsters, saw Capone, he saw the perfect right-hand man. Johnny had a vision, and he needed someone who could work with a cold heart and handle the streets of Chicago. It was Torrio who invited Capone to move from New York to Chicago, and that's where the real story began. But let me tell you, something life in the world of crime is never free of betrayal. Even in the small gangs Capone worked with in New York, he faced problems. His strong, domineering personality didn't sit well with everyone, and people tried to betray him, to eliminate him before he grew too powerful. Okay? But as they say, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. This period in Capone's life was a phase of preparation and learning. He learned that trust must be given cautiously, and that to succeed in the world of crime, you always have to stay one step ahead. With the experience he gained in Johnny Torrio's invitation to move to Chicago, Capone was ready to begin the most dangerous chapter of his life, chapter that would make him a legend in every sense of the word. And at the same time as America was trying to clean up its act and curb corruption, the Prohibition Act of 1920 was passed, banning alcohol entirely. But instead of order, chaos erupted. America became a paradise for mobsters, and Capone saw his golden opportunity. He decided to enter the game with full force. The law was clear: producing, selling, or even transporting alcohol was completely banned. But what Americans didn't anticipate was that people weren't going to stop drinking. Alcohol was a part of everyone's life, from the working class to businessmen, even politicians. And that's where the game began. The government banned alcohol, the mob would supply it, and the profits were astronomical. Capone and Torrio built a massive network for bootlegging. Imagine secret factories, hidden warehouses in back alleys, trucks transporting alcohol right under the noses of the police. Capone didn't just smuggle alcohol, he controlled its production and distribution from the factory straight to the consumer. He had people everywhere, people to produce, people to transport, people to sell. And of course, all of this was under the protection of the mob. When Capone arrived in Chicago, the situation was already complicated. Gangs were fighting for control of the city, but with Johnny Torrio, Capone saw a chance to expand his empire. Chicago was the perfect city: a large population, plenty of money, and a corrupt government that took bribes. Over time, Capone became the #1 name in the city's underworld. The streets of Chicago were under his control. If you wanted to open a speakeasy or sell alcohol, you had to pay a tax to Capone. If you tried to work behind his back, the solution was simple: bullet, and the story ended. But of course, power doesn't come without enemies. And Capone's greatest rival was George Bugs Moran, the leader of a rival gang from Chicago's North Side. The rivalry between them was anything but peaceful. Street wars, assassinations, and bombings became a daily occurrence in Chicago. The tension between Capone and Moran reached its peak with the infamous St. Valentine's Day massacre in 1929, which we'll delve into later. But the important thing here is that Capone was always one step ahead of his enemies. Capone wasn't just an ordinary mobster. He had a clear plan. If you wanted to be the leader, you had to buy everyone. The police, the courts, even politicians were in his pocket, thanks to bribes. And let's not forget his network of informants, who kept him informed of every move before it happened. The money he made from the alcohol trade was so vast that he controlled the entire market. If anyone tried to enter his territory, they either lost everything or ended up dead. In a very short time, Capone wasn't just a mob boss, he became a legend. People feared him, but at the same time, they were in awe of him. His life was full of contradictions, brutality and murder on one hand, generosity and support for the poor on the other. Chicago was his kingdom, and those who crossed him didn't live to tell the tale. But here, Capone entered a new phase of his life, one of absolute control. But as you know, every empire must eventually fall, and Capone's downfall was more dramatic than anyone could have imagined. In the heart of Chicago, Capone wasn't just a mob boss, he was the undisputed king. The entire city was under his control, its streets, its clubs, even its government. But, of course, power comes at a price, and that price was written in blood. Let me tell you, Capone wasn't just an ordinary mob boss. The man held Chicago in his grip from every angle. The alcohol trade, no one could sell without his permission. Gambling, you had to pay your share if you wanted to play. Even the stock market was under his control. Capone's empire was complete, and everyone had to work for him or pay the price. But despite his power, there was one enemy standing in his way: George Bugs Moran, the leader of the North Side Gang. Moran constantly challenged Capone and refused to bow to him, and so Capone decided to put an end to it. The end was bloody in every sense of the word. Let's talk about one of the most brutal crimes in the history of organized crime, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. This story alone encapsulates Capone's ruthlessness and criminal genius. It all started with a meticulous plan. Capone decided he needed to eliminate Moran and his gang in one fell swoop. The planning was devilish. Capone's men dressed as police officers and prepared to fake police cars. The goal was to ambush Moran and his men and wipe them out. On February 14, 1929, Moran's men were gathered in a garage on Chicago's north side. Suddenly, police cars entered, and Capone's men, disguised as officers, ordered Moran's men to line up against the wall. What followed was a massacre, devastating blow to Moran's gang. Capone's name was now on everyone's lips in America. The police, the press, even the federal government were all watching him. But the story wasn't all roses. With all this power, Capone began to face betrayal from within. Greed was the biggest problem. Everyone wanted a bigger piece of the pie. This forced Capone to eliminate some of his own men to maintain the loyalty of the rest. Imagine a man who had to fight his enemies outside while maintaining his grip inside. But despite all his crimes, Capone was a media genius. He presented himself to the public as a successful businessman, even donating to the poor and helping the needy.